In the 1970s, a twisted killer was striking at teenage girls on the streets of Manchester.
The police had never seen anything like it before. They said, "We are looking for a monster here."
His methods were brutal.
Repeated blows from a paving stone had shattered her skull.
And bizarre.
The killer had bitten off her nipple and his teeth marks were left on the body.
Those who crossed his path
Even when I was unconscious on the floor, he was still stamping on my head.
recall an inner fury.
He stood there brandishing the knife. He said, "The next time I'll put it across your throat."
But what led him to murder?
Individuals like him enjoy being violent. It's gratifying for them. It's who they are.
And was he born to kill? In the mid-1970s, the industrial hub of Manchester hit on tough times. As with many areas, the economic downturn took its toll on the close-knit communities to the northeast of the city.
It was very much a working class area, although much of the industry had closed down.
It was fairly rough and ready. Terrace properties with backyards, but all the families knew each other.
It certainly was a hard-working community, but there were elements of criminals amongst that community.
Alan Hart covered the local area as a journalist for over 40 years. But in all that time, one story would unfold that was so disturbing, it would remain with him forever. On the 8th of March 1976, Sharon Mossoff was on a night out. It was a rare opportunity for the 17-year-old, who was the eldest of 5 sisters, had spent much of her teenage years helping out at home.
Because Mum was working, Sharon, because she was the eldest, then started to play Mum. And she did a really, really good job of it. She was really, really so much fun.
She was a really great big sister, you know. She definitely took that role seriously, and she took care of us because she had a very nurturing nature.
We completely respected her because she was just like the whole shebang, you know.
Despite attracting attention from the local boys, the aspiring hairdresser had recently become engaged.
She was a real firecracker, you know, and she was very good looking. But, you know, she picked her horse, you know.
She was quite young, but she was very mature for her age, so it was a natural progression.
On the night in question, Sharon had been to a works night out in Bolton before returning to Manchester. As she was staying with her father in Failsworth, she was unsure of her route home.
She rang her father at around about midnight. She was told by her father what number bus to get, and he expected her home in about half an hour.
Having caught the night bus, the teenager was last seen at a stop just yards from the Rochdale Canal. Her father's house was just a short walk away.
She never did arrive home. There was a big search for her. Her father feared the worst.
The following morning, rookie police cadet 16-year-old Mark Wilkinson received a call to head to the Rochdale Canal.
I think it was the first call we had that particular shift to say that there was the body of a female in the canal. I remember the police officer that I was with said undoubtedly it would be a suicide.
But as they approached, the officer soon realised his initial theory was wide of the mark.
When we arrived here at the canal bank, it was quite obvious it was more than a suicide.
The body was identified as that of the missing girl, 17-year-old Sharon Mossoff.
She was naked, half of her body was above the water level, and it was a particularly cold morning. And I remember quite distinctively that the canal, in fact, had frozen over, so it looked as though she was actually leaning on the ice. I remember looking at this girl who was of a similar age to myself and just wondering what had actually happened.
As investigators and press arrived on the scene, the cause of death became apparent.
That's the part where she was pulled out, just down there.
Local journalist Alan Hart recalls the appalling aftermath of a brutal attack.
She had been battered and mutilated, and the evidence seemed to be that she'd been strangled with an item of her own clothing.
Further examination of Sharon's body revealed another sordid detail.
It emerged that one of her nipples had been bitten off.
News of the twisted murder shattered the world of the victim's close-knit family.
The police came and said, "Can the children go upstairs?" But then we heard our mother screaming. We came running back downstairs, and then we just seen our mum go into the ground. And it was just unbelievable. And our mother was sedated for days and weeks. It wasn't a good situation. To see our mother, it was awful.
But the horrific mutilation of Sharon's body was not an isolated incident. Police would soon discover a serial killer was operating in the area. "20 years previously, the canal and network of Victorian streets had been the stomping ground for a group of local kids.
We're on Stanley Street, Newton Heath. I used to live in this area when I was younger.
Colin Hardy recalls growing up in a close-knit community.
All the kids knew each other. All the kids played together. It was a good area, a nice area.
But despite his close group of friends, Colin soon realised he stood out from the crowd.
I think I was probably maybe about 8 or 9 when I realised that my family was different from sort of other families.
Peter Melia grew up in Newton Heath alongside the Hardys.
The family themselves were well respected, really. It was just that Trevor Hardy was the black sheep of the family.
The second youngest of 4 children, Trevor's delinquent behaviour had been evident since his early years.
He started off by doing a bit of shoplifting, stealing fruit from vegetable stalls.
He did have a really bad reputation for breaking into houses, breaking into premises. People didn't leave the doors open. If they went out, they made sure the windows were closed. Like my eldest brother was good at plumbing, Trevor was good at burgling houses.
He broke into my own house, or my parents' house, on at least 2 occasions.
The people he burgled, a lot of the time, was known to the family. It's as if he was punishing us.
Colin believes his older brother's vindictive streak was sparked by a change in the family dynamic.
Just after I was born, he committed his first offence at 8 years old. I think somewhere there was some jealousy that he wasn't the youngest anymore. I also think he harboured a grudge against my mum because she'd brought me into the world.
As Trevor entered his teenage years, his behaviour became increasingly unpredictable.
As he got older, his violence started to appear.
He was one of those people that no sooner a word than a blow.
As a boy, Peter Melia found himself the target of an unprovoked attack.
I came up over the canal bridge and just something in the corner of my eye, some movement, made me just turn, and he fired this high-powered air rifle straight at me, hit me in the face, between the eyes just there.
Individuals like Hardy enjoy being violent. It's who they are. It's gratifying for them. It's stimulating for them. And it's not to solve a problem, it's to gratify themselves.
As the wayward teenager terrorised the neighbourhood, his father, a British Rail Guard, struggled to cope.
I think my dad was scared of Trevor. In all the years I can remember, my dad never argued with him. He never lifted a finger towards him. But I think my dad would have preferred it if Trevor had just disappeared somehow.
As his behaviour deteriorated, numerous escapes from Borstal and approved schools forced authorities to take drastic action.
He was sent to prison at 15 to Strangeways, Manchester prison, the youngest person ever to be sent there.
Although nobody knew it yet, Hardy's early misdemeanours would one day pale into insignificance as he evolved into a very different type of criminal. In March 1976, the city of Manchester was shocked by the brutal murder of local girl Sharon Mossoff. The 17-year-old was strangled and horrifically mutilated before being dumped in a canal in the northeastern suburb of Failsworth. As detectives set to work, they would soon learn that the killer's twisted MO had been witnessed before in a community nearby. Eight months earlier, 18-year-old Wanda Scala had just landed a part-time job in a local pub. Journalist Alan Hart discovered a teenager who was very much at the centre of her neighbourhood.
People knew Wanda and they'd seen her growing up as a little girl. The community was quite a tough working class area, but the people were decent, honest citizens by and large.
People did look out for each other. Poverty often leads to that kind of commitment and close-knit attitude.
On the 19th of July 1975, Wanda finished her pub shift in the early hours of the morning. The short walk home along the main road was a well-trodden route for the teenager. But as her brief journey drew to a close, she suffered a brutal attack.
She was about a minute from her home when her life ended.
The local girl's body was discovered by a passerby the following morning. She had been partially covered by rubble on the edge of a building site.
The police had never seen anything like it before.
A post-mortem revealed that Wanda had been strangled with her own clothes. Her death had also been caused by a series of horrific head injuries.
Repeated blows from a paving stone had shattered her skull, and her socks had been tied around her neck.
But investigators were also shocked to find an even more disturbing aspect to the barbaric act.
At some stage during this violent attack, the killer had bitten off her nipple, and his teeth marks were left on the body.
Biting off women's nipples is the clearest example of ritualistic behavior. His aggressive instinct and his sexual instinct become fused so that the aggressive act is stimulating. Nothing could be more dangerous than an individual with that type of dynamic.
Senior officers who thought they had seen it all were absolutely stunned. They'd never seen anything so brutal. I do recall they said, "We are looking for a monster here."
In them days, murders was something you read about in London, Birmingham. I think it caused a certain amount of fear, because, you know, whichever way you look at it, there was a killer on the loose.
Police told women to go out in pairs with boyfriends, brothers, dads. A lot of people were scared. This, after all, wasn't just an ordinary killing. This was the brutal, sadistic murder of a very young woman.
As investigators desperately searched for a lead, neighbouring communities in northeast Manchester continued to live in the shadow of a crime spree. Former delinquent Trevor Hardy had built up his empire over a number of years and had even resorted to recruiting local youngsters off the streets.
He certainly attracted a lot of other young people of my age group in the area. He always seemed to have a few hangers-on.
And I think a lot of them were tea leaves, you know. I think a lot of them were thieves. One policeman did call him Fagin.
For much of the time, the career criminal's personal life had also revolved around the young.
Hardy didn't seem to have any steady girlfriends. He had these friendships with younger children.
During his late 20s, one local teenager had made a particularly strong impression on him.
Beverly was a young girl, about 14, bit of a tomboy. I think Beverly liked the idea of being around Trevor because he had this reputation, and most of the time he always had a few quid on him. And I think with Trevor it boosted his ego, having a young girl.
She said she looked up to him as a father figure. Hardy's version of events became different because he claimed that at some stage they'd been snogging, and Beverly said that this was a figment of his imagination.
As Hardy continued to exert control over the local community, his reputation was increasingly forged through fear.
He was a man to be avoided. He was a man who was totally unpredictable.
He had this reputation as a hard man, and he was. He was handy with his fists. He could walk in a pub and empty it very fast.
Peter Melia grew up in the same neighbourhood as Trevor Hardy. Having had several altercations as a child, he would experience Hardy's violence firsthand on the streets of Newton Heath.
I remember walking along this way, coming from a youth club.
Peter was nearly home when he spotted a suspect character crouched in an adjacent alleyway.
There was a light in the yard behind him. He stood up in the light and I could then see that it was Trevor Hardy. He started to jog down here, so I walked on.
Fearful of Hardy's reputation, Peter headed for the safety of home, but only made it to the front door of a neighbouring pub.
As he approached me, he got about 8 feet away and literally launched himself through the air. He headbutted me in the face, and I just felt a really sharp pain in my side. As I got to the corner there was blood in a puddle on the floor near my foot, and I realised at that point that he'd stabbed me. He stood there brandishing the knife, and he said, "The next time I'll put it across your throat."
What drives you to stab somebody? There's got to be something very seriously wrong somewhere.
You know, Hardy doesn't think anything's wrong with him. He sees the world in such a distorted way that he thinks something's wrong with everybody else.
Peter Melia was not the only one to bear the scars of Hardy's fury. As his violence intensified, pub brawls would become the norm. He would be imprisoned following a vicious attack in 1972. Three years later, in October 1975, the neighbouring district of Moston was still reeling from the sadistic killing of 17-year-old Wanda Scala. As police drew up a list of potential suspects, Colin Hardy had received an unwelcome call from his older brother Trevor, summoning him to a local pub.
Well, we hadn't seen each other for months. Well, probably longer than that. A bit apprehensive. I just didn't want to be with him.
Colin had distanced himself from his increasingly unpredictable sibling. Trevor had recently been released from prison when he turned up with his new partner, Sheila.
I think it was probably around about the second pint. It had been idle chit-chat. And just right out of the blue just said to me, "Have you been questioned about the Wanda Scala murder?" So I said, "Well, why should I be questioned about it?" And just as I'm stood here now, he just sat there with no expression on his face and said, "I did it." I did think I'd heard wrong. I said, "You what?" He said, "I did her." My brain just stopped working. I'm thinking, he can't be serious. This Sheila turned around and said, "Colin, it's true." There's not a flicker of emotion in his face. Not a smile, not a frown. My mind just went into overdrive then. If I was scared before, I was petrified now. I wanted to be 1,000 miles away from that room. I wanted to be 1,000 miles away from him. And I just didn't know how to do it. And people might think, well, why didn't you just stand up and shout, "Somebody get the police"? You go into it's like a meltdown.
Struggling to comprehend his brother's extraordinary revelation, a confused Colin eventually allowed Trevor and his girlfriend to accompany him to his flat.
I thought, well, once I get home, you know, everybody thinks you're safe in your own house. But I knew as soon as I walked through the door, I'd made a mistake taking him home.
Colin was about to feel the full wrath of his brother, Trevor Hardy. In July 1975, the mutilated body of teenager Wanda Scala was discovered on a building site in Moston, Manchester. As police searched for the twisted killer, Local career criminal Trevor Hardy had just confessed to the brutal killing to his younger brother Colin. Traumatised by the news, he had allowed Trevor and his girlfriend to accompany him home.
By the time the brothers got to Colin's flat, Hardy, by now sobering up, began to regret his decision to tell Colin what had happened.
It wasn't even 10 minutes since we went through the door. And I think I said something like, well, look, Trevor, you're going to miss the last bus. And that was it then. He went absolutely berserk. Well, I thought I could handle myself, but I don't even remember the first punch.
Colin's girlfriend could only look on at the sustained and brutal attack that followed.
Even when I was unconscious on the floor, he was still stamping on my head. My partner, she was absolutely petrified. I'm on the floor bleeding, unconscious. And he turns round to her and says, I'm feeling a bit hungry, make me beans on toast. And she was that scared, she went in the kitchen, stepped over me and made him beans on toast. And this woman who he was with, this Sheila, she just sat there and never said a word.
Battered and bruised, Colin regained consciousness later that night. The following day, he reported his brother's confession to the murder of teenager Wanda Scala.
Hardy was arrested and police demanded an imprint of his teeth so that they could compare it to the bite marks on Wanda's breast.
But officers were unaware that Hardy had gone to extreme measures to cover his tracks.
He arranged for somebody to smuggle a nail file to him while he was in custody. He'd filed his teeth so that the bite marks on the body of Wanda Scala would not be matched to him.
To file one's teeth down, which is very, very painful, that's quite unusual. This individual really had an awareness of forensic evidence. So he was intelligent. Unfortunately, he used his intelligence in a very, very deviant way.
The case against Hardy received an irrevocable blow when, out of the blue, his partner insisted he was with her on the night of Wanda's murder.
His newly filed teeth, as well as a false alibi from his girlfriend Sheila, meant police had no option but to let him go.
And I couldn't believe it. I said, if you let him go and he effing kills again, I said, be it on your own heads.
Despite his concerns for the local girls in the neighbourhood, Colin was also fearful for his own life.
Well, after that, we turned the flat into a fortress. I put extra bolts on the doors, I put locks, I put wire over the windows, I put broken glass all on the balcony. So basically, we were living in fear.
With his elder brother set on revenge, Colin would suffer another attack. When Trevor only received a suspended sentence, Colin felt the pressure was too much to bear.
I went right off the rails. I got in some trouble and I got jailed.
Although Colin's life had taken a serious downturn, his elder brother Trevor appeared to have turned over a new leaf.
5 months after Wanda's murder, Hardy was branded a local hero in the papers for saving a family from a house fire.
They reported that Hardy, a brave man, had burst into the house and rescued somebody from the fire.
Hardy relished the attention and was pictured beaming in the local papers.
Subsequently, it emerged that Hardy himself had started the fire, not being a hero, but an arsonist.
I don't think he cared as to whether or not people lived or died or the building burned down or whatever. It was just that he could get over on someone. He could manipulate someone. He could fool someone. And he felt good about that.
Trevor Hardy continued to roam the streets of northeast Manchester throughout the early months of 1976. His younger brother Colin was still behind bars when he received some shocking news.
One day, I'd been in the workshops and we'd come back for dinner, and I used to have a paper and right on the front of the Daily Mirror, another girl had been killed, and I knew it was him.
The brutal canal-side murder of 17-year-old Sharon Mossoff bore all the hallmarks of the frenzied attack on Wanda Scala in the nearby district of Moston.
Both Sharon and Wanda had had items of the clothing tied around their necks. They'd both been ferociously beaten, and both had had their nipples bitten off.
There was very little doubt that the person who'd killed Wanda Scala had also killed Sharon Mossoff.
Nobody told us directly, we were children, but we would listen to the grown-ups and we would hear our mother say, apparently he's murdered Wanda Scala. It began to feel very strange to think that this same guy took my sister. So finding that out was really quite strange for me.
As detectives focused their search for a single perpetrator, Colin Hardy could only look on from his cell. Having already failed to bring his brother to justice, Colin felt the latest violent attack was too much to bear.
I've lived with that, and I'll live with it for the rest of my life. Always asking, could I have done more?
The police had been up against an elusive adversary, but finally Trevor Hardy was caught in the act. His brutal assault in an Oldham pub on a local woman bore witnesses.
There had been some kind of a dispute between them in the pub, and he'd dragged her into the ladies' toilets, and he'd grabbed her so hard by the throat that she'd bitten her own tongue, and he'd run away when they'd been interrupted.
Hardy evaded capture for a further 2 months, but his final downfall would come at the hand of his now ex-partner, Sheila.
They went to question Sheila at her new flat in Stockport, where she admitted that she'd given a false alibi to the Wanda murder. Police then put Sheila under surveillance, hoping that at some point Hardy would be in touch, and, as predicted, he did go to visit her and was promptly arrested in May 1976.
When they told me they'd arrested him, the emotions was unbelievable. There was guilt, there was joy. I just broke down, tears. I just couldn't believe it. My family was now safe.
Hardy was detained in prison, suspected of the murders of local teenagers Wanda Scala and Sharon Mossoff. However, just 3 months later, the prisoner made an extraordinary revelation to the lead detective on the case.
When the officer was called to the prison, he revealed an absolute bombshell. And that was, in addition to Wanda and Sharon, there was a third girl whom he'd killed.
15-year-old Leslie Stewart had been reported missing in the Manchester suburb of Newton Heath 7 months before the murder of Wanda Scala.
In those days, a 15-year-old girl wouldn't necessarily be treated as anything other than a missing person. More likely a runaway, and certainly nothing as sinister. as a murder case.
She'd just joined a long list of sad cases of missing teenagers.
Her disappearance on New Year's Eve 1974 had not been linked to the brutal teenage murders that had later plagued the area. On the night in question, Leslie had been dropped off in Newton Heath and was last seen heading to meet her boyfriend at a party.
And that's the last time she was seen alive.
Unbeknownst to the 15-year-old, Trevor Hardy had been lurking in the shadows.
Leslie Stewart was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Another young girl, alone at night, just like the other two.
As Trevor Hardy's confession unravelled, he insisted that he had mistaken Leslie for former teenage acquaintance Beverly. He claimed that on that night he had been hell-bent on revenge after the young girl had severed ties with him during his recent spell in prison.
As Leslie got out of the car that was dropping her off, the driver said, "Good night, Leslie." But tragically for her, Trevor Hardy thought he heard the word Beverly.
So he shouted, "Hey, Beverly." When she turned round, he stabbed her in the throat.
After watching Leslie bleed to death, Hardy dragged her to a secluded spot where he dug a shallow grave, then walked to his parents' house where he watched a Hogmanay TV show with his mother.
But Hardy's gruesome account didn't end there. He insisted on taking police to the scene of the horrific murder in Newton Heath.
If memory serves, it's pretty much where the net is, round about there that her body was found.
Although almost 2 years had passed, the 30-year-old gave a detailed account of his attempts to conceal Leslie's body.
He claimed that in the first instance, he'd not buried it very deeply. And so after a few days, he came back, buried it a little further.
But Hardy hadn't just been intent on covering his tracks. Detectives were about to learn the full extent of the killer's depravity. In 1976, Trevor Hardy was facing charges for the murders of 2 teenage girls in northeast Manchester. But in an extraordinary twist, the local man had also confessed to the earlier killing of missing 15-year-old Leslie Stewart, taking police to the murder site in Newton Heath. Having located a shallow grave, investigators were horrified to discover that the corpse was not complete.
He'd mutilated her body, cutting Leslie's head off. He buried it somewhere else. Then he came back again, cut her feet off, and buried the feet somewhere else nearby.
All this was in view of a local school, and he had boasted that the kids had seen him dismembering the parts and playing with them and burying them without knowing what he was up to.
He even took a ring off her finger and gave it to his girlfriend as a love token.
What kind of a person goes back to a body and does what he did?
There was something with that victim that really grabbed him. He was certainly attached to that victim in a way that he wasn't attached to others. He kept going back to relive the experience, to further mutilate the body, and to do other things with the body to continue the gratification.
That is a killer who enjoyed killing.
In April 1977, Trevor Hardy was sentenced to 30 years in prison for the murders of Leslie Stewart, Wanda Scala, and Sharon Mossoff.
Subsequently, he was told life would mean life and that he would have to stay in prison for the rest of his life.
In the wake of Hardy's reign of terror, many struggled to comprehend why he had targeted the young teenagers. Although the profile of his victims bore marked similarities, Hardy maintained that 2 of the attacks were purely random.
I've never believed any of the excuses he's given. Wanda Scala, a mugging that went wrong. I don't believe that for 1 minute. Why mutilate the body? No, he enjoyed it.
These individuals feel very weak inside. They feel very inadequate inside. And so it's not at all uncommon for them to target children, young adolescents, until they gain some degree of comfort in killing, and then they might attack someone who might show some level of resistance.
But was the twisted violence dealt by this sadistic killer the inevitable result of a troubled life? Or was Trevor Hardy born to kill?
Lots and lots of people had similar upbringings to Trevor Hardy, and they didn't go off the rails in the way that he did. He is one of these people who is just pure evil.
My friend who lived on his street said he would kill animals and everything when he was a kid. He was just a very sadistic person.
Considering how many murders he did and how much violence was in his life, I definitely think that he was born to just be a killer.
He was supposed to have had some kind of an accident when he was young, and it involved his skull. And there was a splinter of bone, and when he got excited, this bone pressed on the brain.
I don't like to say someone was born to kill, but he certainly had a predisposition for violence. And head injury can weaken someone's inhibitory controls and make it much easier for someone to act out their impulses or what's going on internally.
For many, the horror of this brutal killer has faded away. But some will never forget.
I was just unfortunate enough to have him as a brother, and it'll never go away. You get up day after day and you just get on with your life. I decided to take part in this programme because I wanted my chance to tell my side of things. I have not asked for any payment. I would not insult the victims' families by asking for payment.
And for those who lost their lives, their memory will always remain.
We don't shy away from talking about Sharon because she was our big sister and she was a big part of our lives.
She's just remembered as a really, really, really fun, fantastic, nurturing, loving big sister. She's missed every day. She's missed every single day. There's not a day goes by that we don't think about her.